Welcome back to Knitty Knotty Hand Dyed Yarns. Teaching you how to do the knit stitch today. So if you haven't already looked at the video for getting started and casting on, you'll want to do that because that shows you how we got to this point. So you want to do that first. But now we're ready to start our knit stitch, which is one of the two primary stitches you'll use in knitting. Now we did this long tail cast on. And now we have this tail here, and we have the yarn going to our yarn ball. We want the yarn going to the yarn ball in the back. Okay. Now there are a lot of different ways to knit. I'm going to show you the two most common today. But you always want, if you're doing the knit stitch, your yarn that's going to the ball should be in the back of your needles. Okay. Now you want to bring your other needle around, or if you are using a straight needle, just grab the other one. Your work that you just did, that you cast on, we're going to flip it over to the left hand here. Okay. And so we want to make sure this kind of stays out of the way. It doesn't really matter as long as you don't accidentally knit with it. You always want to make sure you're knitting with the yarn that's going to the ball. A lot of people accidentally will knit with their tail, and then you figure it out halfway through and you got to pull it all back out, and that's a bummer. So make sure you're not doing that. Okay. For the knit stitch, we're going to insert our needle from left to right in that first stitch. Okay. So you're going to come all the way on the left side, go through to the right, making sure you don't catch that back yarn. Okay. Now, some people do what's called throwing. So they hold the yarn with this hand and wrap it around and then pull that loop through there, and then we can push that off the side. Okay. That is a nice solid way to knit, but it is not very fast. So, it is a little bit easier in my opinion to learn it that way, but then, it's a little more time consuming. So you can also hold it in your left hand. Some people like whip it around their finger, do all kinds of things. I also crochet, and I learned to crochet first, so I'm very comfortable holding my yarn this way, and then I can tighten my fingers to tighten up tension if I need to, that kind of thing. So that is how I hold it, but it doesn't really matter how you hold it, just so long as you have control over the yarn with your index finger where it's going to go, and you have control of the tension with your other three fingers. Okay. But again, if you hold it over here, doesn't matter where you hold the yarn, you're still going to go in the left side of the stitch, through the stitch. But if I'm holding the yarn on this side, instead of wrapping it, I'm just going to scoop that yarn through there, so pulling the loop through. And then once you have that through, you can knock that one off. So left to right, and then we're going to hold this yarn here, so we're scooping it through. Okay. Now again, this way I think is a little more difficult to learn, only because it's a little harder to control the scooping of the yarn, and sometimes you'll split your yarn or get the needle in between the fibers, and that it's kind of a pain in the butt. But it is much faster, so if you can get used to knitting this way, definitely do that. You'll be happier in the long run, but that's okay. So left to right in the needle and scoop. Now see, I caught the back of this. Now I have two, so that's incorrect. You want to go through there, catch that one, and pull it through. Do you see the difference of what I did there? Okay, so we're just going to knit here so I can show you how to get to the end of the row. I'm sorry about that. Whoops, we're bouncing all over the place. There we go. And you might have to move your work closer to the tip as you go. It depends on how tightly you knit and how much room you give yourself. I tend to knit very tight, so I usually end up working most of my yarn at the tip of the needle where it's not as fat, so there's a little bit more room to maneuver everything I'm trying to do. So knit, knit, knit all the way to the end. And then once you're all done, on a straight piece, so on a circular piece like a hat that you've connected, you don't need to turn the needles around. You would just keep working. On a flat piece, you will have to turn the needle around and then start working back across the other side, just the way you started on the first side. And this last stitch is going to look really loose, but once you knit that one in, I promise it'll tighten it up. See? And then you can work across. So if you're doing your knits, it's not going to look like what you imagine knitting and the knit stitch looks like, because if we're knitting both sides, then technically we have a knit on one side and a purl on one. So the purl is an opposite of the knit. So what we knit over here is a purl on this side. So if I'm knitting on this side, then it's going to look like a purl on the opposite side. So we're just going to keep on knitting. And then I will show you what it looks like after a few rows. Okay, so I've done about 8 rows of knitting each side. Now that is called the garter stitch. So you'll see you can see the little knit stitches, and then because I knit going backwards the other way, you have your purl stitches. And then you have your knit stitches and your purl stitches. So that's what happens when you knit every single row. One thing I did want to mention is when you're turning your work, you're normally going to see your string is, or your yarn is going to be hanging in the front, because in the back when we're going this way, so you turn it around and it's just naturally going to be here. Be careful not to put your yarn in the back by bringing it over, otherwise you're going to add an additional stitch here. So if you are like, oh, we'll just do that, now you have an extra stitch and you're going to add stitches and you're going to be off and it's going to be frustrating. So so you don't want to do that. So make sure when you're moving your yarn to the back, I always like to make sure that it's totally in the back. Sorry about that. And then on the bottom, going underneath, and then bring my needle around. So I work with the yarn first, then I grab my other needle. That way I always know that it's in the back, underneath, and I'm not accidentally adding additional stitches. So that is the knit stitch, and on the next video I'm going to keep this piece here and we're going to work on purl stitches, okay? And then I can show you what it looks like when we do a knit row and a purl row alternating.